Learning objectives. In this chapter, we are going over chapter 17 from the Mosby's Pharmacy Technician Principles and Practice, 5th edition. In this lecture, you should be able to describe the major components of the nervous system, including the components of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So, as an introduction, when it comes to the central nervous system, you'll also be able to list some of the primary symptoms and conditions that's associated with the dysfunction of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to recognize the medications used to treat some conditions, diseases, and disorders that relates to the CNS and the PNS. You'll also be able to write the generic and trade names for the drugs that's associated with the conditions in the nervous system, as well as list appropriate auxiliary labels when filling prescriptions for medications that's associated with this system. So, as an introduction to the nervous system, you should understand that the central nervous system is a complex system for controlling and coordinating movement and functions of the body. So we have two different systems when it comes to the nervous system. You have the CNS and you have the PNS. Now with the CNS, central nervous system, our nerves perform internally in an involuntary function. And I'll be going over some examples of what that represents. Now, with the central nervous system, it consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and it works by coordinating the sensory and motor body function control. Now, with the PNS system, the PNS is the nervous system that works outside of the brain and the spinal cord. So, motions like sense, smell, taste, things like that, or even our voluntary functions. For example, if I move my arm, I'm telling my arm to move. So that's a voluntary function. Whereas we have some things that is involuntary that's going to continue to happen. Kind of like our heart beating, we can't control that. So it's an involuntary function. But I'll go into more of that as we continue in this chapter. Also, for the CNS, we're going to better understand how it's broken down into the different divisions. So now that I've given you a little bit of an intro in regards to some of the information that I'll be talking about, let's go into some of the main functions of the nervous system. So the nervous system has four main functions. One includes the impulse that's sent to the nervous system, to the central nervous system, of impulses that's sent from the central nervous system, and you also have a coordination of activities of all of the parts of the nervous system, as well as the sensory function that detects changes in the body. So overall, one way to understand the nervous system is that it coordinates the body's function. So with our nerves, it allows us to detect and respond to stimuli, which is basically changes within or outside of our body. Now, with the central nervous system, there is a certain structure. So the main point of our body is to make sure that it's kept in the balance mode. And another example of how the nervous system is maintained is homeostasis. So you should understand that homeostasis represents an equilibrium. So means the body balance. So in learning about homeostasis, which represents the body's tendency to maintain stability, for example, like body temperature, we understand that the CNS has two main functions, and that's in regards to the brain and the spinal cord. Now, with the peripheral nervous system, which is abbreviated as PNS, we have peripheral nerves, and those have four distinct functions. You have two that's efferent and two that's afferent. And the examples of what are the differences between efferent and afferent. The two efferent distinct functions represent the highways for motor impulses from the CNS muscles. And with afferent, that's where the impulses carry from the soft tissue areas, and it goes into involuntary muscles of the body. and then also other organs that goes back to the CNS system. Inside of our CNS structure, we also have neurons, which is the smallest functional part of the CNS system. And so when we think of the peripheral nervous system, which you should remember it works outside of the CNS, it includes, again, the afferent, which represents the sensory branches, and the efferent, which represents the motor branches. The afferent, which again means the sensory, those work by and the CNS. Now, when we further divide the efferent system into the somatic nervous system, or also known as the autonomic nervous system, which is abbreviated as ANS, it should be understood that the ANS has two main branches, which has the SNS, which is the sympathetic nervous system, and the PSNS, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. And we'll describe that later in the lecture. So one of the first things we're going to go over in regards to the nervous system is understanding the neuron. So inside of the neuron, we have billions of neurons that make up the nervous system. Now, with the billions of neurons that run through the body, they carry messages back and forth from the CNS. And so inside of our body, we have four main sections. There are four main sections, inside of the neuron. You have the cell body, the dendrites, the axon, and the nerve terminal. Now, the dendrites work by receiving electrical impulses. You may think one way how I remember the dendrites is to remember when we get like a idea or like I like to call them the aha moments, our dendrites actually start working. As a reminder, please make sure that you are muting your background unless you have a question, because that is being picked up on the recording.
Ella levantó a las 7, 8 y yo le di un bibí ahí.
Okay, make sure that you're muting. Make sure that you're muting. This is being recorded. All right, so continuing learning about the neurons. The cell body processes messages for axon. If you look inside of your book, it kind of gives you a better description of what this looks like. I will also share with you guys some videos on the central nervous system so you can get a better understanding of how it actually operates, but that will be sent in another message. Now, continuing learning about the neurons, you have the myelin sheath, which is a specialized insulation wrapped around the axon. It's basically composed of the same fatty matter as in the white matter of the brain. And within the neuron, it also helps with impulse conduction. So with neurons, again, the neuron is the smallest unit of the nervous system. And inside of our neurons, we also have the cell body, which processes the electrical message before it enters the axon. So in continuing learning about the neuron, we'll learn that the PNS nerves, they form a bundle, which is made up of axons. And then you have different types of cell bodies. So the bundles of the cell bodies, an example of that would be called ganglions. And then with the CNS, the axons are called tracts. And then the cell bodies are called the nuclei or the ganglia. Now, inside of the neuron, you also have what's called neurotransmitters, and these are chemicals that transmit electrical impulses. So what's a neurotransmitter, you might be thinking? A neurotransmitter are chemicals that's located in and is also released by the neurons. They work by providing impulses emitted and sent from one nerve cell to another. Now, neurotransmitters can excite or inhibit other nerve cells or body tissues, And the nervous system uses the neurotransmitters to communicate messages. And they work by binding to receptors that specifically activate, like a lock and key, which works by triggering a response. So now that we've talked about the neurons and learned a little bit about a neurotransmitter, let's next learn about the nerve transmission. So inside of the nerve transmission, there are three main states of a neuron. It's polarized, depolarized, and repolarized. So what does polarized mean? Polarized, or better known as a resting state, that's where there is a negative charge inside of the neuron, potassium and chloride. And you see in parentheses the chemical elements of the potassium, which would be K, and then you see the chloride. Inside of the polarized, or better known as the resting state, you also have a positive charge outside of the sodium. So inside of the nerve transmission, the one of the stages of the nerve transmission, we've talked about the polarized. Next, we'll learn about the depolarization, and that's where the neurotransmitter activates the cell membrane, and that happens by having the sodium, which rushes through the channels, which an example of that would be where the negative inside changes to positive. Now, one of the other main stages of the nerve transmission is the repolarization, and that's where the cell is restored by the resting state by allowing potassium to re-enter the cell, and the sodium is transported back to the outside. So inside of the nerve transmission, you'll also understand that um, when the cell repolarizes, it brings it to full circle and then back to the resting stage, which is known as the polarization. So now that we've talked about the nerve transmission, we'll next talk about the structure of the brain. And so it's important to understand that the brain has several sections. Now, the largest brain area is the cerebral cortex that has gray matter that lies over the white matter. Now, the brain is composed of two types of matter. Gray matter, which is the neuron cell bodies and the dendrites, and then you have the white matter, which is the bundles of nerve fibers, and that's the myelinated axons. And so, as I mentioned before, the brain has several different sections, so therefore it has specific functions. So, some of those areas inside of the brain is the cerebrum, which is the largest area. And so, our cerebrum works by containing the ability to reason. That's also where our memory is, so it helps us remember. And then in the cerebrum is also where we understand how to speak a language and also how to create. Now, inside of the cerebrum, inside of our brain, we have two hemispheres. You have the right side, which controls the logical thinking process, and then you have the left side, which controls creativity. You might have heard of a saying or possibly a phrase where people say people who are left-handed tend to be more creative. That's because they are working off of more of the left side. So inside of the hemispheres, we have four different lobes, and each of them have their own function. So the four different lobes are the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the temporal lobe. So now, with the functions and the brain structure, those functions cover six senses: hearing, vision, balance, taste, touch, and smell. And then we also have motor functions, which helps us to control our muscles. Now, inside of the cerebellum, that's at the base of the brain, it works by controlling most of the muscle functions, as well as precise movement of the body, which could include balance, posture, as well as overall coordination. So with the brain stem, understanding how the CNS system is connected, there's a brain stem that connects the brain to the spinal cord. And so inside of the brain structure, you have three main midbrains. You have three main areas, excuse me, and those are the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, excuse me. So those three areas are linked to many areas of the brain. And so I'll say those three main areas of the brain structure again. That's midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. And so understanding the brain uh, inside of the nervous system and understanding that the brain stem connects the brain to the spinal cord, when you look inside of your book in chapter 17, you'll get a picture in figure 17.5, which shows you an example of what happens when a person's knee is tapped, kind of like if you were to go to a doctor's office. As the knee is tapped, there are impulses that's sent to and from the brain, and the neurotransmitters affect the specific receptors that are interpreted. And so basically the reaction that's sent from the neurotransmitters is going to jerk the knee. So that's why when a person goes to the doctor and they check for the reflexes, this also shows how their nerves are working with inside the body. So now that we talked about the brain and its structure, we are next going to learn about the blood-brain barrier, which is abbreviated as BBB. Now, the blood-brain barrier works by protecting the brain and the spinal cord. It also allows only certain types of small molecules to enter the brain. Some examples of that would be like lipid-soluble drugs. Now, the blood-brain barrier works by preventing molecules from entering and possibly damaging the brain via a chemical reaction. Now, even though the blood-brain barrier prevents certain molecules and substances, for an example, like bacteria from entering. However, if there is an infection that happens, the barrier may block some of the treatment. And also there are small viruses that can easily pass through. So viruses that can attach to immune cells that cross into the brain. There are certain properties that make medicines more or basically less likely to cross the blood-brain barrier. And so there are small lympholytic, think of it like as a fat-loving molecule that can pass readily through the blood-brain barrier, for example. So as I mentioned before, you have some drugs that are either water or fat soluble, and it's easier to understand that more fat soluble drugs can cross the blood-brain barrier. So one of the things that you need to understand in regards to as being a pharmacy technician is that the brain's nerves crisscross. So the brain's left side controls the right side of the body. Therefore, stroke victims can lose the ability to move parts of their body on the opposite side. So that's why even when people claim that they're having a medical emergency, such as a heart attack, and they start grabbing their left arm, that could also be an indication that a person might be suffering from a heart attack. That is one of the reasons. So just wanted to give that as an example. So now that we've learned about the blood-brain barrier, we're going to continue learning about the hypothalamus and the thalamus. So the hypothalamus and the thalamus are between the midbrain and the cerebrum, and this works by having chemical reactions linking the nervous system to the endocrine system. And so with the hypothalamus, it works by having a basic built-in thermostat, and it also is known as the appetite center. And so with the thalamus, it's in charge of the most sensory stimuli, and it interprets and relays messages that's sent to the nervous system. The thalamus also initiates motor impulses from the cortex, which is also inside of the brain. So as we continue to learn about the body system and the nervous system, we'll next learn about the spinal cord. So we went over the brain portion and understanding about the different lobes in the brain, which represents the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. We also went over the neurons and the nerve transmission, and we also learned about the differences between the CNS and the PNS. So in continuing learning about the other part of the nervous system, because we learned that the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, now that we talked about the brain, let's next learn about the spinal cord. So with the spinal cord, it's divided into sections, and each section is identified by an attachment location along the. So there are five main areas in the spinal cord. You have the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, the sacral, and the coccygeal areas. So the cervical area represents the neck, the thoracic area represents the chest, the lumbar represents the lower back, and the sacral relates to below the lower back. So in learning more about the spinal cord, we'll understand that it's composed of inner gray matter that houses many nerve cells. And outside of the white matter, you have what's called nerve fibers. So inside of the spinal cord could be a possible meninges, which is a thin covering lining the inside of the bones, and it works by covering and protecting the brain and spinal cord from bony structure of the skull and the spinal column. Now, with the CSF, it has a cushion to the brain and the spinal cord, and it's a watery liquid. Now, meninges in CSF work by protecting and cushioning the central nervous system. So we were learning about the spinal cord, and you may even be familiar with the segments of the spinal cord. And so they're numbered differently. And when I refer to the spinal cord, it's important to understand as a pharmacy technician, one of the tech notes is that the autonomic system is an involuntary branch of the peripheral nervous system, and the autonomic system has two divisions. You have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So stress causes the sympathetic system to release the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, whereas the parasympathetic system releases acetylcholine when we are at rest. Now, acetylcholine, which is one of the neurotransmitters, acetylcholine's abbreviation is ACH. And as you see representing CSF, you might be thinking, what does CSF mean? CSF represents a watery liquid, and so it represents the abbreviation cerebral spinal fluid. So that's CSF. Cerebral spinal fluid, and that's spelled CEREBROSPINAL. And so within the spinal cord is inside the vertebral column, and it serves as a path from the brain to the PNS. And the vertebrae protects the spinal nerves. And within the vertebrae, there is an inner gray matter, which houses many nerve cells, and then you have the outer white matter, which contains the nerve fibers, which I went over earlier. So as we learned about the spinal cord and understanding how it connects to the brain, we're next going to learn about the cranial nerves. So with the cranial nerves, it originates in the brain matter, and it also has a specific function, which is labeled by Roman numerals and the name. So cranial nerves have 12 pairs of cranial nerves that originate from the brain. And again, these nerves are designated by Roman numerals and have specific functions. And so the numerals represent the fibers location from the brain's front to back. And so most nerves have sensory and motor fibers, and there are 3 sets that have sensory fibers only. And so the cranial nerves, you have, C1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And then in the thoracic nerves, it's represented as T1, T2, T3, T4, all the way through 12. And then the lumbar nerves, which would be L1, It goes all the way from L1 to L5, and these are examples of the primary functions of the cranial nerve. And so now that we've talked about the central nervous system and understanding its functions between the brain and the spinal cord, we'll next learn about the peripheral nervous system, which represents the senses and also involuntary branches. And so the peripheral nervous system is a subdivision of the PNS. And again, it controls the automatic functions. And now with the involuntary, those two branches are the sympathetic nervous system, which is abbreviated as SNS. And then you have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is abbreviated as PSNS. Now, they both work by regulating the organs, tissues, and blood vessels, and they both are made of nerves and ganglia. So with the peripheral nervous system, as we learn about the autonomic system, both systems have neurons of approximately the same length from the CNS to the target tissue. Now, when ganglia occurs, that's where you have a relay, a synapse, which is where it's located. You also have nerve fibers that are preganglionic or postganglionic. And then the neurotransmitter has its own receptor to contact the opposite synapse. And so in regards to the peripheral nervous system, we talked about the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And so one of the main neurotransmitters of the sympathetic nervous system is norepinephrine and epinephrine. And so it has four main receptor types that respond to these neurotransmitters. Examples of that would be the peripheral blood vessel, the heart, and the eyes have alpha 1 receptors. And we primarily find that alpha 2 receptors are on the smooth muscle, and primarily beta 1 receptors are in the heart muscle, whereas beta 2 receptors are in the respiratory system, blood vessels, and elsewhere in the body. So with the sympathetic nervous system, it also carries the function to respond to stressful situations such as fight or flight response. And during the fight or flight response, we have a non-essential body system that might shut down. And with our energy, it can be redirected to other areas or even the muscles. And then inside of the sympathetic nervous system, it works by sending impulses to various organs and tissues for emotion. For example, the feeling of feeling anxiety or stress, or even when we feel like hating something. The sympathetic nervous system nerves emerge at the thoracic as well as the lumbar regions of the spinal cord. And so within the sympathetic nervous system, there are, again, two main neurotransmitters. You have norepinephrine and epinephrine. Now, I talked about some of the types of receptors, but understanding where those work and where those are. The alpha 1 receptors, again, are located in the peripheral blood vessels. Examples of that would be the heart and the eyes. The alpha 2 receptors are located on the smooth muscle. The beta 1 receptor is located on the heart muscle, whereas the beta 2 receptors are located on the respiratory system as well as elsewhere. So now that we've talked about the sympathetic nervous system, we'll next learn a little bit about the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is the opposite or a counterbalance of the sympathetic system. And so the nerves work by emerging from the brainstem and the sacral part of the spinal cord. And so with preganglionic nerves, those are located in the gray matter of the brainstem as well as the spinal cord. And these have an activation of the digestive system. It works by slowing the heart rate. It also works when we're resting, and it also works by inhibiting when the sympathetic activates under stress. And so in understanding about the parasympathetic system, we also understand that parasympathetic receptors which respond to acetylcholine, which again, remember, acetylcholine is another type of neurotransmitter. When the parasympathetic receptors respond to the acetylcholine, they're on the smooth and cardiac muscle cells and in other body areas. So now that we talked about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, we'll next learn about cholinergic agents and cholinergic blockers. So the main neurotransmitter of the parasympathetic is the acetylcholine. So we learned the main neurotransmitter of the sympathetic nervous system, which is epinephrine and norepinephrine. Well, the main neurotransmitter of the parasympathetic system is acetylcholine. As a reminder, acetylcholine's abbreviation is ACH, and it works by being important for the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Acetylcholine also works quickly with the short duration of action. And when it comes to the cholinergic agents and the cholinergic blockers, there are two types of cholinergic agents, and those mimic the acetylcholine, and it's called the parasympathetic mimetics, and those work by stopping the destruction of the acetylcholine by the acetylcholinesterase, which is also called anticholinergics. And so even though it sounds like a lot, when you think of anticholinergics, there are some medications that work by stopping the impulses in the nerves. And so with anticholinergics, those work by blocking the acetylcholine receptors. And so there are some side effects, which include dry mouth and also the inhibition of urine output. That basically means the person might even have to take like a mouth rinse because of dry mouth. The saliva dries out in their mouth quickly. So this is going to complete part one of the therapeutic agents for the nervous system. And then part two, we'll talk about the medications in the conditions of the nervous system.